Welcome to the next in our series of speaker interviews. My name is Maurice Button. I'm the CEO of City and Financial Global, and it's my pleasure to have with me today Chris Leeds, who's the Executive Director and Head of Carbon Markets Development at Standard Chartered Bank. Chris is going to be speaking at our forthcoming summit, the International Carbon Markets Summit, in London on the 30th of October. Chris, welcome.
Thanks very much, Maurice, and it's good to be here.
Great to have you with us. My first question is really, can you set the scene? Can you tell us more about the latest developments in the international carbon markets?
Yeah, happy to. So the market's developing, but I would say it's probably at a slower pace than we would like to see. There's been some very interesting developments this year, particularly around regional exchanges. So we've seen a number of new platforms developing and new initiatives that are being generated really on a regional basis. So a few that come to mind are the RVCMC, the Regional Voluntary Carbon Market Company, which is based in Saudi Arabia, the Indonesian Exchange, Climate Impact X, which we are one of the founder shareholders. But then you've also got things like Hong Kong, the HKEX are trying to establish their core carbon market. And then ACX have entered into a relationship with Mubadala in Abu Dhabi, and they're setting up an exchange there. So we do have a number of these regional, but also global exchanges. And the one thing I would say though that's common across all the markets and really across the OTC market as well for the voluntary side of things is that liquidity remains low. Apart from the main compliance markets, where obviously you've got that compliance and mandatory driver, liquidity is pretty low in the voluntary markets, and so it's a little disappointing. And I think that's partly driven by some of the reputational issues that we had earlier on in the year. And these are the issues that the initiatives such as the ICVCM, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets that I'm a board member of, and the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative are trying to solve. Basically, we've known about these issues for some time around some of the reputational concerns, the quality concerns, the consistency and the standardization of contracts. So I'm really confident that with some of the announcements that have been made over the summer with ICVCM and also with VCMI both releasing their CCPs as it happens, so core carbon principles for the ICVCM and the claims code of practice for the VCMI, and that's a really good step forward. So I'm really excited about developments around that, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more news around that as we head towards COP in November.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, hopefully those developments, those two initiatives you mentioned are going to make people have greater faith in the integrity of the voluntary carbon market. In regards to that, I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about how the VCMI claims code of practice will work?
Yes, so the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, was established to give assurance to buyers. And it's to give assurance to buyers, civil society, and stakeholders. And that net zero is truly achievable, but also to make it work, we need to go above and beyond. It's not just about making a commitment to reduce your own value chain emissions, it's also making that commitment to go beyond that. Every company needs to be able to make a credible VCMI claim. I think that's really where we need to get to. And then you can be in a position where you can call out those that don't. So what VCMI have done is they've come up with a series of different claims that can be made at the moment, different colors as it happens. But I think that's going to be refined, and I think also we're going to see a further differentiation of claims, so that you will be allowed, it will give companies a way of being able to say, I'm on the path, I'm doing something, I'm actually making a difference here, I'm really trying to actually not just reduce my emissions, but to have an impact and to get finance into projects that just wouldn't get it otherwise. And remember, that's one of the values of the voluntary carbon market, is it allows us to get financing into projects that just wouldn't get this money, and it goes above and beyond what would happen ordinarily. companies committing to reduce their own value chain emissions, absolutely, that's key, that's important. But if we could all reduce our emissions as quickly as we need to, we would have a much fewer problems. But that's the difficulty. It's the fact that actually we can't reduce emissions that quickly. There are many sectors out there that where emissions reductions are very difficult. The hard to abate sectors: aviation, shipping,
Yeah.
steel, cement. But even with road transportation and energy, it will take time. And we've seen recently how important fossil fuels are, to just be able to power our economy today, and the impact that it has when prices go up dramatically very quickly, or indeed we are curtailed for one reason or another. And we've seen the unfortunate issues in Ukraine that have led to that around the world. So that transition is really important, and I think that's where the voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets in general come in to facilitate the transition. It allows companies to do something now, and to be able to get that finance into those projects that wouldn't get it otherwise.
I think that articulates the case for the voluntary carbon market really well, and what you just said. And obviously, the VCMI claims code of practice, I guess, will give companies comfort that they're not going to face greenwashing claims from various people, and increased sort of litigation and activism from various NGOs and other stakeholders. So it's got to be a very good thing. And coinciding with the COP28 discussions, where do you see those going on Article 6, and what do you think the market implications of that might be?
Well, I think it's an evolution. We saw at COP26 in Glasgow in 2 years ago now, the Article 6 framework getting put in place. But as we know, that was only part of the story. So it set up the underlying framework and the agreements and the really important decisions around corresponding adjustments. This ability to actually transfer within effectively the carbon credits, to ensure that we don't that double counting doesn't occur, but also to keep countries honest, because obviously if they're having to transfer credits out of their own inventory, they've got to make sure that they're doing something to reduce emissions in their own country, and that they're additional. So we've seen that evolution. So I don't expect any major changes in a COP28. I don't expect to see anything revolutionary happen, particularly around Article 6.4, which is the area that the UN's really having to deal with and to focus on, because that is the UN's own system that will allow the UN to issue carbon credits effectively. And there's a lot of work that needs to go into that. The supervisory body has been set up, but they are then having to make decisions around which methodologies are applicable, and how they're going to be assessed in future. And I think in some ways that's actually in parallel and coincides with some of the work that the Integrity Council's doing, the ICBCM's doing for the core carbon principles. So what I do think we'll see is we may see a lot of announcements around Article 6.2. So governments making announcements around how they're going to work together, how they're going to cooperate. We've seen this already with Switzerland and a number of countries, Ghana, Kenya most recently, Thailand, Japan has been doing a lot of the work on this side. Interestingly, some of the other EU countries, such as Sweden, are likely to make announcements, we believe, as we head towards COP. And I think that we will hear some of the other governments, and particularly in the Middle East, potentially Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, making announcements around cooperation, MOUs with countries to facilitate financing going into projects, and then credits actually being transferred from a host country to a donor country. So in many ways, if they get this right, and it facilitates not just government to government transactions, but business to business transactions through this facility, it does a lot of the work that Article 6.4 is supposed to do, and increasingly, I think it will mean that we'll see much more trading done through 6.2 as private companies come in to use those facilities to get private finance into projects in these host countries. And again, it's going to be interesting. So there's a lot of talk within the voluntary markets that corporates are going to want to see and buy only credits that are where there are corresponding adjustments attached, if you like. So credits that sit within 6.2 or 6.4. So where does this leave the voluntary market? And actually, I think that there is a complementarity. I think there is an understanding that the voluntary market credits don't need to be correspondingly adjusted. It's about ensuring that you're getting funding into those projects in the first place on the ground, and that that corporates can actually be seen to be making their contributions by funding these projects, getting carbon credits for that. If they need to make claims at a domestic level, so for example, if they're using a carbon credit against a tax, as we're seeing in places like Singapore and South Africa, then they may need to see those corresponding adjustments, and you'll then see a transfer at the national level, the national accounting level, as well as at the corporate accounting level.
Yeah, interesting time. So, as you say, fascinating to see how that works out. You mentioned Singapore just now, and my last question, because we're pressed for time, sadly, is how do you see the relationship between the mandatory and the voluntary markets developing and evolving? And of course, with Singapore, you're able to use carbon credits for what is it to meet 5% of your carbon tax liabilities. So do you see across the world some degree of evolution or complementarity between mandatory and voluntary carbon markets?
Yes, I do. I do think that's going to be something that we'll see, and I hope we do see more of it. I think you have to go back and you have to remember why the voluntary market exists in the first place. It's effectively filling a regulatory gap. If the regulations were there, then I think that the voluntary market would have evolved quite differently. But it's there because companies wanted to be able to make a contribution, to do something to help reduce emissions as quickly as possible. And so, I don't think we should ignore that, and we shouldn't write that effort that's been put in already, and a lot of work that's gone into developing the voluntary markets. But they can be complementary to the compliance markets, and ultimately the compliance markets, we need to see that mandatory pull, if you like, the compliance driver that will ensure that companies do actually go out there and invest and support the financing. So what I think we'll see is this evolution. What part of that can happen through linkages, as we're seeing in Singapore and South Africa and potentially Japan, and then part of that I think will happen with the way that the voluntary markets are considered and included within the compliance markets. And so I think that there is that there is that complementarity between the two. At the end of the day, we're looking at how we measure impact and how we measure the performance of the money that we're putting into these projects, and that is measured in a ton of CO2, and that's something that's common to voluntary and compliance markets. So I think that there will be a continued evolution and convergence of these markets, and particularly as we see the development of the standards and the core carbon credits becoming more widely adapted. And I think that ultimately we will see one market that comes together. It will take some time over a number of years, but that's definitely the direction of travel.
Very good. It sounds like it's a promising time for carbon markets, and it'd be fascinating to see how this works out. Now for our viewers, if you want to hear more about this topic and hear more from Chris and our other speakers, please note that the event, the International Carbon Market Summit, is taking place in London on the 30th of October. We'd love to see you in person. Chris, thank you very much for sharing those insights with us.
Thank you.